Welcome to our latest Novedge webinar episode, everyone. This week, Maxwell Render and the camera parameters. This webinar will focus on the real-world parameters of the camera in Maxwell Render, how to set the correct exposure for different lighting situations, what is depth of field, and how to use it to guide the viewer's attention. What is EV, how focal length affects perspective, and more. Just a sample of what Basics and Beyond course is all about. Mihai Iliuta, our presenter, has been using Maxwell since the first alphas were released in 2006. He is a certified Xpert Maxwell user and has worked for a number of years with the Maxwell Render team. These days, he runs the site maxwellzone.com, where you can find extensive video training materials and models for Maxwell Render, like his Basic and Beyond course, for instance. And here it is. Basic and Beyond combines the self-pacing learning and convenience of video training with the personal hands-on advantage of a workshop. Visit our store at novedge.com to find Basic and Beyond, Maxwell Render, and also huge assortment of software solutions that cater to virtually every designer's need. And for more daily software news and limited time promotions, pay a visit to the Novedge blog and follow us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. Coming up tomorrow, a webinar on Bluebeam review for Mac. Last but not least, today's webinar is free and is being recorded live. So if you want to rewatch this or any webinar episode in our collection, just head on over Novedge's YouTube and Vimeo channels. And now, without further ado, I'm going to pass the screen to Mihai, and he will be starting working on Maxwell right away. Take it away, Mihai.
Thank you, Barbara, for that nice presentation.
Stunning.
Yeah, it's just a quick 5-minute, scene
Beautiful.
I made of a card just to.
You just whipped it up in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Maxwell is really fast, really. It's much faster than people think, in my opinion, anyway. So then, welcome everyone to this webinar. So this is going to be really focusing on purely how the Maxwell camera works, which essentially is how a real-world camera works. So hopefully, if you're not too familiar with, how photography, how a digital camera works, what those all different little digits on a lens, camera lens mean, then hopefully this webinar will help you out and also make it easier for you to create more interesting renders. And so let me just start my little PowerPoint here. So the topics we're going to cover today, really the exposure of the camera, the so-called focal length, the depth of field, and then a few extras like the shift lens, the EV, and also the lock exposure parameter in Maxwell. So to start off with the simplest of these topics, the exposure. So the exposure is really controlled by three things. The first one is so-called ISO, and this is really the sensibility of the film, or these days the digital sensor, how sensitive it is to light. The second thing that controls the exposure is the so-called f-stop. So this is actually the aperture of the lens. When you make a wide aperture like this, for example, the f1.4, it lets in more light, so then you have a brighter exposure. Or when you stop it down, as they say, you make this aperture much smaller, so then a lot less light goes through to reach the sensor. And the third thing that affects the exposure is the shutter speed. So the shutter speed really, if you're only doing stills, then you're not going to be so interested with the shutter speed, but you might still be interested even if you're doing stills, because the shutter speed will also affect the motion blur. So for example, if you want to do light trails or things like that in your still renders, then knowing how the shutter speed works is also a nice thing to know. But just to go through the exposure, what affects the exposure. So the ISO, first of all, the ISO parameter. So unlike real-world digital cameras, when you change the ISO, you're not going to actually add more noise to the render or remove noise from the render with a lower ISO. So it doesn't affect it in that way. It's simply just an exposure control when you're dealing with the Maxwell camera. And it's actually there because it's the only parameter that affects only the exposure and nothing else. All the other parameters, so the two others, the f-stop and the shutter speed, they also affect other things. So the f-stop will also affect the depth of field, and the shutter speed will also affect the motion blur. So the ISO is the only one that affects the exposure and nothing else. So it's a very convenient parameter to have when you only want to change the exposure. So you only have one slider or one parameter to change. And it's one of the parameters that can be modified before, during, or after rendering. And it's exactly the same also with the shutter speed, as you'll see in the multi-light. And just to stop here and go through the exposure, I made a little scene here. So this is a scene of an interior, and typically I see many new Maxwell users have a problem understanding exposure compared to the lights they have in their scenes. And in this particular scene, I'm also using the physical sky from the environment, but I also have 3 small light bulbs in these lamps here. And when I created the emitter material, I just used the default power and efficacy settings. So this is basically your typical 40-watt light bulb, incandescent light bulb, because it's not very efficient. You can see you only get 700 lumens out of it anyway. So it's a typical light bulb. And if you use a default camera, so you create a camera in Maxwell, in the optics section here, you have almost all the parameters that control the exposure, and in the sensor section you also have here the ISO. So if you leave the default settings, they're actually set for a camera that's going to give you a proper exposure during a bright, sunny, daylight exterior render. Okay, so for your typical interior render, even if you have physical sky on, you may not get a proper exposure. It may look too dark. And also, if you render this, your typical light bulbs here will hardly be visible. So here you can see that with multi-light, if I solo out just the emitters from these 3 lamps, it's basically you don't see anything here in that apartment. So when people see this and they don't know how to control the exposure of the camera, the first thing they do really is just crank up the power here to maybe 60,000 watts, so that the light bulbs will be much brighter. And then you have, let's see if I increase the range of the slider. So I right click on the slider, change range, and set this to, let's say, 100,000 watts. Okay, so people do this instead and say, okay, that looks nicer, like what I want. But the problem with this approach is that, for example, now if you want to add a few more lights to your scene, let's say you want to add some LED lights here in the kitchen that are specific wattage and efficacy settings. How do you know what balance you should set between these two to make a realistic render as they would be balanced in the real world? So the tips I have for you is stick always to real world values for your emitters and start changing instead the camera exposure, because this is what a photographer in the real world would do. Okay, they would start by changing the exposure of the camera to have a more balanced scene. And also, if they wanted to have interior illumination, they wouldn't take the photograph in broad daylight. They would take it a little bit later in the evening when the sky is much darker and maybe there is no sun. So then you can start lowering the sun and the sky influence. And by the way, if the step here you can see between 0, so completely off, to 0.1 is much too big, especially for the sun. What you can do then again is to change the slider range and change it from default of 10 to just 1. Okay, and now, and also, sorry, change the decimal precision to 2 decimals. Okay, so now you have a much better, much more fine increment between the changes here for the sun, and also I'm going to do the same for the sky. So just a value of 1 and change the decimal precision. So to change the decimal precision, just right-click in the numeric field itself and change it to 2. Okay, so I'm just trying to do maybe a more late night sort of environment, and then I can start changing the ISO to raise the exposure of the main render itself, and maybe just a little bit stronger on the lights. This is much too sensitive now since I set it to 100,000. Okay, so always try to keep working with real-world values when you adjust your exposure and when you set your emitters, because then you won't sort of paint yourself into a corner when you mix emitters and you don't know anymore what's the relationship between those emitters in your scene. Okay, so try to avoid that first instinct to just raise the emitters and think about the camera exposure instead and what it would be like in the real world. And you have a drop down here called exposure, which sort of gives you a ballpark value of different situations, which are a good starting point for your exposure. For example, the default camera is set to a bright exterior. You can see here that the shutter speed is set to 500 of a second, the ISO just 100. But if I switch it to, let's say, a dark interior, you can see how big of a difference. And this is very real-world stuff. This is what a photographer would use for a dark interior. So the shutter speed then becomes just 1/10 of a second, and the ISO is 800. Right, so that helps you to quickly set your different sort of broad exposure settings here for different situations. All right, so that's the ISO. Now moving on with the f-stop. So again, the f-stop refers to this aperture on the lens that sort of opens and closes. And as I mentioned, this also affects the depth of field, which I'll mention in a minute. And the f-stop goes from this scale, which looks a little bit weird. So the base really is 1.4, and it goes to 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22. So in Maxwell it can go much higher than this, but usually all the lenses in the real world have a limit of about f22 because otherwise you have some optical artifacts like diffraction and things like that. So just mentioning this in case you want to stick to real world values. And it has this weird scale because each of these increments actually represents a half of the light that reaches the sensor. Okay, so it's actually the square root of 2, which is 1.4. Then if you stop it down, so you have half the diameter of this aperture, you get half of the light. So the halving of the light, depending on the I'm trying to keep this a little bit simple because it also has to do a little bit with the focal length, but the scale goes to f.2. It doesn't go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, because it's the power of that square root number. So 1.4 times 1.4 is 2, and then 1.4 to the power of 3 is 2.8, and so on. So that's why you have this weird scale. But anyway, it's not so important. It's just to make you realize that when you're going to change the f-stop, so let's say you're going to go from 5.6 and you're thinking that you want to decrease the amount of light by half, if you go to something like f12 or f11, you're actually going to have 4 times less light reaching that virtual sensor. And again, it also affects the depth of field, which I'll show you in a little bit. And actually, let me show you render here. Actually, I can show you this later on when we're going to talk about depth of field. So the third thing, the shutter speed, this is a little bit easier to understand because so you have two types of shutters really. You have a still camera shutter, which is just this sort of curtain that moves up and down very quickly when you press the shutter on your still camera. And then you have a film camera shutter, which is actually this rotating disc here that has an opening in it that decides how much time the film is exposed to light. So since the Maxwell camera really can do also animations and stills, it's sort of automatically going to adjust the shutter speed if you're doing animations to mimic this so-called film camera shutter. But for our purposes today, just to keep this simple, you're only going to set the shutter as if you're dealing with a still camera. Okay, so it's measured in increments of a second. So if you have, for example, let's say 1/10 of a second, that's really considered a pretty slow shutter speed. You use this, as you saw in that drop down for exposure, you would use this in, let's say, a dark interior. And then it can go, 200th of a second, that means half of the light again, 400th of a second, and usually goes up to 1/8000th of a second, and that's really going to freeze any moving parts in your render. So that's really the shutter speed, and again you can change this before the render, during the render, and also after the render. And when you're dealing with stills, show you this example again. Don't worry about which of these you're changing, because in a still image they do exactly the same thing. There's absolutely no difference between either changing the ISO or the shutter speed. They just raise or lower the exposure, just as long as you know what you're doing. And of course, if you're at ISO 100, if you set it 200, that means double the light. It may not seem that way, but it is actually a double of the light. And the same with the shutter speed, really. So you don't have that weird scale like the f-stop setting, which is a little more complex. So if you set it to 800 shutter speed, then you get half of the light reaching the sensor and so on. Okay. If you set this to 1, the shutter speed, that's as if you're setting the shutter speed to 1 second. So be aware of that. Here to 10, it's 1/10 of a second, 100th of a second, and so on. Now then, going to more interesting parts of the camera, which is the focal length. So first of all, a little scary definition what the focal length refers to, and it makes sense to understand the definition because it will make sense why the different lenses look like the way they do. So the distance between the point of convergence and the sensor film plane is the focal length of a particular lens. So the point of convergence is this little point in the lens where the light flips, and then the distance from this point to the actual sensor is your lens's focal length. So that's why you see on these lenses 28 millimeters, 50 millimeters, 100 millimeters, and so on. Okay, and a short focal length lens is usually called a wide angle lens. So usually 24 millimeters, that's beginning to be a sort of like an extreme wide angle lens. They can be even 12 millimeters, that's a very wide angle, extreme wide angle lens. And they have the effect of actually distorting objects that are close to the lens. So the closer the object will be to the lens, the more distorted it will look, because a short focal length lens, a wide angle lens, really exaggerates the perspective. And on the opposite side of the scale, you have these long focal length lenses that are called telephoto lenses, and they will also give you a narrow field of view, meaning they're going to have sort of like a binocular effect. You see sports photographers use these lenses all the time because they need to be far away but also be able to zoom in on a particular player. So that's why they have these huge lenses that cost tremendous amounts of money. And they also have the effect of flattening the perspective. So let me just show you a little bit really of what I'm talking about through some real-world examples. So here I have a scene with these three objects. Okay, so they're placed at different distances from the camera here. And right now I'm using a focal length of 50 millimeters, which is considered sort of like a let's say medium focal length. It's supposed to mimic how the human eyes sees a particular scene. So as I lower the focal length here, so I'm creating basically a wide angle lens. If I set it to, let's say, 24 millimeters, you can see that that has two effects really. I can see a lot more of the scene. So this is what I would use if I'm rendering something like an interior. Of course, if I want to see more of that interior, I need to lower the focal length to create a more wide-angle lens, and you can see my field of view increases, so I can see more of this scene. But the second effect it has is that you can see here, if I would zoom in, or if I move the camera very close to this table, you can see now that the corner of this table is much more distorted compared to the rest of the scene. It looks like it's huge now. So this is what it does really, a wide-angle lens. It distorts the perspective, it exaggerates the perspective, and you have to be careful with that in certain scenarios, especially I guess with interiors it's not that big of a deal, but if you're doing product renderings, then you have to be careful to not exaggerate the lines of that product too much. So for example, if I go here with these birds, just clone this camera. As you can see here, if I would move into this bird here and I set a very exaggerated focal length, you can see here how distorted this bird looks now. You can see its feet look huge compared to, let's say, the rest of the body if I move the camera this close to it. Okay, now on the opposite side of this, if I turn this into a telephoto lens, you can see what happens. I'm sort of zooming in on the scene, and that has the effect of lowering my field of view, so I have a more narrow field of view. I see less of the scene, but also I'm flattening the perspective. So if I actually move the camera back now, okay, so I'm moving the camera back, way far back here, so I have more or less, I get back the same field of view as I had before. So let me actually set this to, I think it was 35. And this camera here, the View 1, you can see that a focal length of almost 150 millimeters, but I have the same field of view. You can see now that with the 35 millimeters, I can really get a sense of how much closer this particular bird is to the camera compared to the one that's farthest away. But with a focal length of 140 millimeters, really the perspective is so flattened now that I can't really tell how far apart these three birds are anymore. And if I show you this with the birds, Here you can see the 35 millimeter render, and then here with the 143 millimeter focal length. You can see it has a quite interesting effect here. How much flatter the perspective looks with the longer focal length here. I get really no sense of perspective anymore with such a flat focal length. So there are no right or wrong focal lengths here. It just depends on what you want to achieve in your render. And just to show you a little bit more how you can use this to your advantage, so here's another render of that car. And one of these renders I did with a really long focal length of 200 millimeters, and the other one is with a focal length of 35 millimeters. Okay, and I try to keep the same field of view for both renders. And you can see what a huge impact that can have on the shape of your design, right? So keep this in mind that with a flatter perspective, it may be interesting to do that with certain angles, because you can think of it as really, let's say you were drawing this design, and if you want to convey just the lines of that design and sort of remove the perspective almost completely, then it makes sense to use a longer focal length, because it really brings out just those pure lines of your design as if you were showing them a drawing of your design. And the shorter focal length really may not be so suitable in this case. You can see also, because the rear view mirror here is closer to the camera, you can see it also gets exaggerated, and people would think that it's huge, really, and you don't get that nice flattened perspective as you do with a longer focal length. Okay, so use the focal length to your advantage. So anyway, just to give you an idea of the categories of the different lenses, so from about 20 millimeters to 35 millimeters, the lens is considered a wide-angle lens, and then from about 85 to 600 millimeters, it's considered a telephoto lens. And again, the field of view of human vision, it's roughly 50 millimeters. So if you want to do a render really with minimal perspective distortion and sort of like how humans would view something, then you would use about a 50 millimeter focal length, so that you would still have a bit of perspective, but you don't get a lot of distortion that you would get from a wide-angle lens. All right, so just as I mentioned with that car model, if you want to exaggerate the features of a model, then use a wide-angle lens and move the camera really close to your model. But on the other hand, if you want to remove that perspective, then move the camera back a lot, and then use a telephoto, use a long focal length to just compress that perspective. And so again, it can have a huge impact on how a shape is perceived, and also how the lighting really will affect your model, the focal length. And here I just found these two images on the internet that really show this off. So this is a photo of a person taken with a 200 millimeter lens, and then the exact same model with a 24 millimeter lens. And you can see how completely different the face looks with these two different lenses. And never take a photo of your girlfriend or your wife with a wide-angle lens, because it's going to really make the nose huge and make the face really weird. So never take portraits of people with a wide-angle lens. And it's quite a huge difference that the focal length can make. And you can see also that the lighting can change dramatically because of the focal length and the fact that you have to move the camera much closer to your subject to have the same field of view. All right, so now getting to the depth of field, which is arguably also one of the most difficult to understand about photography in general for new users. So the definition of the depth of field is really the area of the photo that's going to be an so-called acceptable focus. So There are some strange formulas about what people consider to be acceptable focus, and I won't go into that. It's just really the definition of what is in focus in your photo. And the depth of field is affected primarily by the f-stop parameter. So with a wide aperture, so when your aperture is very open, you get a more blur in your render, and photographers call this a narrow depth of field. So it's just going to be a very thin slice of your render that's going to be in perfect focus, and then it's going to quickly become blurry as objects are closer or farther away from that point of focus. What makes it a little bit more complex to understand is that it's also affected by the focal length, and I'm going to try to show you why that happens. And when you increase the focal length, you're actually also going to get much blurrier parts of your render. So it's going to have a sort of a increasing effect of the blur in your render as you increase the focal length. And let me just show you that now in these renders. So actually, let me just start with this one. So here my camera has a f-stop of 2.8, which is sort of considered a pretty wide aperture. So I'm going to get quite a bit of blurring, and my point of focus, what I'm focusing on right now, I'll just switch the view so you can see here. Hide these cameras. Okay, so this is the camera I'm using, and you can see here that the focus here is set on this white bird. Okay, and you can see the amount of blur for this bird that's closer to the camera from that point of focus, and this one that's further away. And now if I set this to a very wide aperture, like 1.2, you can see now again that of course the exposure changes, but also the amount of blur changes. So if I don't want this change in exposure, I only want to affect the amount of blur, I only want to affect the depth of field, then I can check this box here, lock exposure, and that's going to automatically adjust the shutter speed to keep the same exposure if I change the f-stop. Okay, so you can see the shutter speed decreased here to keep the same exposure. And you can see now how much of a difference that makes in the blurriness effect by changing this f-stop. And by the way, you don't have to go into these particular increments, so 1.4, and then from that 2.8 and so on. You can use any value you want here, really, even fractional values. So you have a lot of control. I'm just used to setting these values because I'm used from real-world photography. I sort of know what to expect when I change these to these particular values. Right, so the f-stop controls this blurriness amount, and just to show you here, actually let's go back to the camera, switch this to 2, and so you can see this info here a little bit better. So what do these numbers mean here? FD, near, far, DOF. What do these mean? So let me try to explain that to you quickly, because there's always not enough time. So here's that scene with the camera that's pointing at this bird here. So the FD stands for focal distance, and that's really where the camera, the distance from the camera to the camera target. And you can change the camera target easily by either moving the camera here, and when the circle here is on the object that you want to be in focus, you press F on your keyboard, and that will actually change the camera target to point to where you pressed F. So here, if I change it here, press F, you can see that the camera target points here now. And another way to do that is just numerically here with the camera parameter panel. You can change here the target distance. So target distance, focal distance, it's the same thing really. You can see here the FD number changing here, and it's the same number as this one here. Okay, so that's the FD. Now the near number here, which is a little bit more difficult to understand, that's going to be really the end of that so-called acceptable focus distance from the point here, from the FD point, from the focal distance point. So the acceptable focus will end here at the near distance, and then from here closer to the camera things will get blurrier and blurrier. And the same principle then for the far distance, or the far focus distance, is that from this point on and further away from the camera, things will get blurrier and blurrier. So then the depth of field is really this slice of in focus that you will have extending inward and outward from your focal distance. This is really what we refer to as the depth of field. And you can see here in this particular example that the total depth of field here is just 2.8 centimeters. So everything in Maxwell here is in metric. So you have a very small depth of field here with just 2.8 centimeters that are going to be in focus. And as I raise the f-stop, you can see that my depth of field also increases, so more and more of my render is going to be in focus. So if I set the focus again to this bird in the middle, let's say I set a very narrow or very small aperture like f16, you can see now that suddenly my depth of field is going to be almost 30 centimeters. So almost everything will be in focus now. Of course, this depends on the scale of your scene also. Okay, so now almost everything is in focus and my depth of field is 30 centimeters, and because this scene is, okay, so the grid here is 1 centimeter between these lines, so I have about 15 extending up to here and about 15 extending up to here, so almost everything is in perfect focus. Just the beak of this bird is not going to be in perfect focus. Now if you don't want this depth of field effect at all, you can always switch the lens to pinhole, and that's going to not give you any depth of field effect at all. Everything is going to be in perfect focus, which may not be so realistic, but when you're testing out materials or you're testing out the scene, it might actually help to just set the camera to pinhole, and then when you're ready to do your final render, switch it back to so-called thin lens, which takes into account the depth of field settings here. Or you're going to get that depth of field effect of blurriness. Okay, now I mentioned also that the focal length is actually going to affect a little bit your depth of field. And you can see here that in these two renders, so my focal length here is 35 millimeters, and here it's 143 millimeters. I didn't change the f-stop, and in this particular case you can see that the blur effect is quite the same even with such a huge change in my focal length, and that's simply because I kept the field of view sort of the same. What I did was I actually increased the focal length. So by increasing it like this, I sort of get a zooming in effect, but then I moved the camera back to get sort of the same field of view. And in that case, you're not going to get a different blur effect from your focal length. But on the other hand, if I would have just simply changed my focal length without moving the position of the camera. So here I'm just simply zooming in here and changing the focal length. So here if I set it to 85 millimeters, you can see that now I get a much more exaggerated blur effect by this bird here closest to the camera and this one farthest away compared to the blur effect of my 35 millimeter focal length. So this is why it gets a little bit confusing for people. When does the focal length matter for the depth of field and when does it not? It really affects it if you change the focal length without also changing the distance of the camera to your subject. You can see that makes quite a huge impact on the blurriness effect without actually changing the focal length at all. Right? And to try to explain to you why this happens, if I try to mimic what I did in the 3D scene here, and you can see your depth of field here represented by this green frame here. So if I take the camera and I mimic what I did just by changing the focal length, so I'm narrowing my field of view. So this is what I did when I changed it to 85 millimeters. So then it does something like this. You can see now what happens with that depth of field. It's now almost sort of just half of the width that the original depth of field had. And that's why you get this more exaggerated depth of field effect as you increase the focal length. Okay. On the other hand, if I zoom in by changing the focal length, but now I also move the camera back so that I get more or less the same field of view as I had before. Okay, you can see that now the depth of field here sort of goes back to normal, so to speak. It goes back to the same width that it had before with a wider field of view. So that's why in this case when I move the camera back I don't get much change in the blur effect here. So anyway, hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer how focal length can also affect your depth of field and how you can use it to your advantage. And I just wanted to show you this render as well. So when should you use depth of field? When should you not use it? And I mean, it depends. It depends on where you want to guide your viewers' attention. So for example, if you had a product where you wanted to really guide their eyes to a certain feature of your product, then probably it would be a good idea to use a smaller f-stop to create that blurriness effect. So usually our eyes are drawn to what's in focus, really, compared to this render, which is set to f16. So the one before it was f1.1. This one is f16. So in this case, maybe, you know, what's correct, what's wrong. In this case, I'm also drawn to this air vent here, which might look pretty cool, and you also want this in focus. And many times photographers in the real world have trouble creating these images because the way the lenses work, you can't have everything in focus. You would need to sort of take two photos and then combine them in Photoshop so that everything is in focus. But again, with Maxwell it's easy. You just set a very high f-stop and you have the same exposure with the lock exposure, so that's very easy to get exactly what you want. So it's just, I'm just mentioning this to keep in mind that you can use depth of field as a tool to make more interesting renders and guide your viewers' eyes to things that you want to be sharp. They're going to look at the things that are going to be in focus. Right, so just to wrap things up quickly, a few more extras. So the lock exposure, I talked about that. It automatically changes either the f-stop or the shutter speed depending on which parameter you change, just so that it keeps the same exposure. And now the EV, you saw that that is also a parameter in the camera, and this is really a sort of a standardized scale describing how bright a scene is. And each increment in your exposure value is either going to half or double the exposure in your render. So, for example, if I render this quickly, so if I set this to, let's say, bright exterior, in the photography world, a bright exterior will have an EV number of about 14, okay? And then if you set it to 14, if I set this to 13, that means I'm doubling the exposure. Okay, I'm going to have twice as much light in the scene. 12, again, doubling of the light, 11, and so on. Okay, so the EV number can be also a nice parameter to have. Just for example, if let's say I want this to be 4 times brighter than this is, then I would set this to 8. Okay, compared to what it was at 10. If I wanted this, you know, 2 times darker, then I would set this to 9 and not mess with the other parameters. Okay, so it's just a handy, quick parameter to have if you want to quickly double or half your exposure. So you don't have to mess with figuring out, okay, what's the half, what's double of 16.3.2 and stuff like that. Okay, now quickly about the shift lens feature. So this allows you to achieve a so-called two-point perspective, and this is really crucial for architecture renders. So if you're not familiar with what a two-point perspective is, let me just quickly show you that. So if I set this back to a more normal focal length, so 24. So usually when you look at architecture magazines or renders, let me find an angle here that better show this. So this wall here. When you're doing architecture renders, so both exterior, interior, you want to avoid making renders that point the camera up or point the camera down, because when you do this, you have a so-called three-point perspective, meaning that the vertical lines here are going to converge at some point, and that can have the effect that, you know, the room is sort of falling away from you, like from this example. And what you want really is to have the vertical lines completely straight, and you achieve that by setting your camera height and the height of your camera target. So you can see here the camera, these are the coordinates for the camera, and these are the coordinates for the camera target. You set these at the exact same height. Okay, so now I've achieved this two-point perspective because the vertical lines are not going to converge anymore. I only have a two-point perspective. And now the problem you may have is that, let's say you have a wall here. So the room was just this big, and I can't move the camera further back, right? So what I would need to do now to also capture more of the ceiling is, with the shift lens parameter here, you can offset the film plane. So you can see here I'm capturing less of the floor, which perhaps isn't that interesting, and more of the ceiling without actually having to move the camera back. Or of course, I could have also changed the focal length and make it even more wide angle to capture more of the ceiling, but that would also have a more and more distorting effect of my scene, which it just looks really weird here. So if you don't want to change the focal length to avoid distortions, just use the shift lens. So it simply shifts your image up or down, or also left and right, without actually moving the camera around. That's really all that the shift lens does, and it's really important for architectural renders. Right, so I think, yeah, that's 50 minutes. I think I'm going to wrap that up. Barbara, if there are any questions.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. There are no questions. I have a questions. I would like to know a little
Oh,
bit more about Basic and Beyond. Tell us about how your course
oh,
works.
oh, okay. Well, so the course I thought to combine sort of the video training, the typical video training, with the advantages of a workshop. So when people buy the course, they don't just get the videos, they also get 1 year access to a private forum where they can ask me any questions about, if they have a particular problem with a scene, they can send me the scene, I can take a look at it. So it's sort of like a combination between the hands-on of a workshop with the self-paced learning of a video training program. So
So
that's,
you'll be there on demand whenever they need
yeah,
you. If there's something,
exactly.
that's great. So
Yeah.
yeah, I urge everybody to check it out. And we have
Yeah,
it.
maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's about finally 25 hours of video because I really go into detail about stuff and also what I talked about today, also talk about in the course and yeah.
Fantastic. I don't see any other questions. The few questions that I had were about, will this be recorded? We want to see it again. So, which I think it's great feedback. And
Yeah.
I'm going to take the screen back if it's okay with you. I'm seeing, oh, that's enough with my car. Uh,
What?
yeah,
No problem. No, it
it
just
looks
people
great.
wanted to, if people were curious, because usually the lighting setup is very simple, and here is just a plain emitter, which is pretty close to the car, and then just a second emitter here for the sides for the second render with depth of field. And just wanted to mention quickly that this is one of the reasons that I'm not too big a fan of HDR lighting. So when you light the scene simply with HDR environment, because you don't get this proximity effect of the emitters in your renders, which can be quite interesting to have. So I'm not knocking HDR lighting, it's just that it's not the end of all lighting solutions. And anyway, I'll talk a little bit more about that in my video course.
Oh,
Just
great.
wanted people to
Yeah,
see the setup if they were interested in that.
cool.
All right.
That's great tip. Okay, Mihai, I'm going to have to take the screen back, and I would like to thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I want to remind you that if you want to check out Basic and Beyond, just visit our page at novedge.com and search for Maxwell Zone, and you'll see the product amongst other things. We also have Maxwell Render, the new version before will be coming out soon. So, this is a great combo. Get a new version and get also a good training that will help you optimize the tools. And for information on the latest specials and release, sorry, I'm going back and forth. Just visit us on Facebook or Plus or Twitter. And I want to remind you that I recorded this session and it will be posted on our Novedge YouTube and Vimeo channel as early as this afternoon. So come back and visit us for this or other webinars. It's great, working with you again, Mihai, after a long time, and looking forward to do this
Yeah,
again in the future. Thank you,
sure.
everybody, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.